In this lecture, you're going to be introduced to cost behavior. Now, whether you know it or not, different costs behave differently. And understanding cost behavior is very important for management to make improved business decisions. It's important to note that we're not talking about different costs. We're talking about the exact same costs that we used before. Direct materials, direct labor, insurance, all the costs that were associated with manufacturing overhead. What's different is we're looking at categorizing them differently. Like in the past, when we categorized them based on whether or not they were associated with the product or the period, now we're categorizing based on what type of behavior each of these costs have. And when we understand the behavior of each of these costs, then we can put them in a category based on variable, fixed, or sometimes mixed cost. So let's first look at the variable cost behavior. A variable cost is a cost incurred for every unit of volume. The more the factory makes, the more the variable cost. If they make less of a product or service, then they have lower variable costs. If it's a service company instead of a manufacturing firm, then it's the more customers that are served, the more the variable cost will be. Less customers served, less variable cost will be. So some common examples. Direct material. We looked at the example of the skateboard factory. The more skateboards we make, the more wheels we use. The less skateboards we make, the less wheels we use. See what I'm talking about? Commissions. A commission based on, for example, purely on sales. So if you get 10% of your sales, then the more sales you make, the higher the commissions are. If you have zero sales, then in that case you would have zero commissions. Fuel would be a good example. Let's take Southwest Airlines. The more they fly, the more fuel they use. If they park all their planes, they don't use hardly any fuel. The same with shipping. So you can see the common thread here. The more that happens, the more the variable costs are. Let's look at an example company. For our example company, we're going to look at a bed and breakfast business. So a good example of a variable cost for bed and breakfast would be the coffee. The more guests they have at their bed and breakfast, the more coffee they're going to use up. If they have no guests, they'll probably use very little coffee. Let's look at the variable cost in a graph. And on the bottom part of the graph, we have the volume, meaning the more customers we have, the more we're going to go to the right. So 0 customers would be on the left, and then the higher the customer count, the farther we go on the right. And then the cost is going to be on the vertical line. So we're going to go from 0 cost to a higher cost. First, let's look at a variable cost for each unit. So what this means is the variable cost for each guest we have. So let's say the coffee costs us $1 to brew the coffee and put it in a to-go cup for the customer. Notice how the cost stays flat, because for every customer it only costs $1. No matter how many customers you have, each person we only spend $1. That's why it's a flat line. But what's interesting is when we look at the variable cost in total. When we look at the variable cost in total, we'll notice that the cost goes up the more volume we have. Note what I said earlier. The volume is how many products that are made in the factory or how many customers are served. So the more customers we have, the more we spend on coffee. If each cup of coffee costs us $1, then if we have very few customers, then our cost is very low. But as our volume goes up with more bed and breakfast customers, our coffee goes up. That's the idea of a variable cost. It varies by volume, by the number of customers or products we make. Keep in mind, a variable cost doesn't mean it varies per unit. In other words, it's not like something like, let's take the price of gasoline going up and down per gallon. That's a fluctuating cost. We're not talking about fluctuating costs. We're talking about variable costs, and variable costs are only going to change based on the volume of customer or the volume of product that we make. It's not a fluctuation per unit, it's a change in total cost. Next, let's consider what they call a fixed cost behavior. We'll look at a couple of graphs to explain fixed cost behaviors in a second, but first of all, a fixed cost behavior is a cost that remains constant regardless of volume, meaning you're going to have to pay that amount no matter how many customers or how much product you make in your factory. Common examples would be something like rent, right? A common rent setup is that you pay a set amount every month. It doesn't matter if you have a lot of customers, or you make a lot of your product in your factory or not. You still got to pay the same amount. Other common examples are property tax or straight line depreciation or salaries. Think about if the salary for your manager is $80,000 a year. It's not going to change the salary if there's a lot of things made or a lot of customers or a very low number of customers. The salary would remain the same, at least in the short run. For our bed and breakfast, let's look at the fixed cost for each unit, for each customer, and we'll also look at the fixed cost in total. Let's look at the fixed cost in total first. Notice that the fixed cost in total stays flat, meaning no matter how much volume we have, no matter how many customers stay at our bed and breakfast, our rent remains the same. If our rent is $2,000 a month, then it's going to be the same $2,000 a month no matter how many customers we have. Now, of course, we have to keep in mind this is for a relevant range. What that means is you can't have a million customers at your bed and breakfast. So this is within the range that we're able to fill the capacity of our bed and breakfast. And the same thing goes for if you have a factory, then the factory is only going to be able to put out a certain capacity of product. So the fixed cost stays the same within that relevant range. Within that relevant range, you'll notice that it does stay the same. Now, when you look at the fixed cost for each unit, what you're saying is, well, if we have a certain set fixed cost, but we have a lot of people, how much does each customer, how much does each person at our bed and breakfast have to cover for the fixed cost? Well, let's look at that in a little bit more detail. Notice that the fixed cost for each unit goes down. Now, this is usually shown as a concave line, but for our purposes, we'll just use a straight line. And what that says is that the more customers you have, then your fixed costs are easier to cover. So let's look at some numbers to make it kind of easier. If your fixed cost in total are $100,000 for the year, let's say your rent, your property tax, the salaries, those fixed costs that have to be paid each and every month come to $100,000 for the year, and then you have 2,000 guests, then that means that each guest you would have to charge at least $50 per guest in order to cover those fixed costs. So that would be the minimum you would have to charge to cover those fixed costs. However, if you have more guests, then the cost goes down per unit, and let's say you have 4,000 guests in your bed and breakfast, you would only have to cover $25 per guest. This is also called Economies of Scale. You might have heard it in other classes in that capacity. Now, some costs don't fit nicely as either a fixed or a variable cost. They kind of act like both. Now, some costs don't fit nicely as either a fixed cost or a variable cost. They have components of both in the way they behave. So a common example could be a delivery truck, that the delivery truck you pay $50 a day and then you pay 20 cents per mile. So there's a variable amount, you pay more by driving more miles, and then there's a fixed amount, it's $50 a day whether you drive at all. Utilities are typically mixed costs, although it just kind of depends, but think about it like this. You usually don't have zero utilities when you leave. Let's say for vacation, you come back, there's usually a minimal amount because you have your refrigerator and your air conditioner or heater running. And then at the same time, if you are at the house a lot using a lot of electrical components, then you're going to have more utilities. Maintenance, you can't, for example, just park a vehicle and expect it to run, a year from now. There's a minimum amount of maintenance that needs to be done, but we also know that the more you use the vehicle, the more maintenance you're going to have to do. One more example, a commission with a base salary. So let's say the base salary is $50,000 a year plus 10% commission. So you have both a fixed amount, $50,000 a year, and a variable amount. Let's look at that on a graph. So in our example, we're going to look at a mixed cost for utilities at our bed and breakfast. So we know that no matter what we do, even if we have 0 guests, we're going to have a minimum amount of utilities. This amount is the fixed amount. So you notice it starts on the cost line. It doesn't go to 0. It starts at a certain amount. Let's say we know we're going to spend $100 a month on utilities no matter what. So that level from there down is the fixed amount. But then the more guests we have, the more we use the air conditioner, the more we use the refrigerator, the more we use the television, etc., then your utilities are going to go up. So that amount from the line down to the fixed line is the variable amount. Now when we look at this, we're become aware of a formula that we can develop, and that is that in our business, the business's total cost equal all the variable plus all the fixed cost. We can look at the formula over here to the right. The total cost, we'll use the variable y, is equal to the variable cost, the v times x, or the variable cost per person or per product that we manufacture, times the number of people or the number of products we manufacture. That's why it's v times x, plus the fixed cost, which is a constant. We can use this formula in a lot of different ways for a lot of different analysis. It's important to note that variable cost and fixed cost and mixed cost are not the only types of cost behavior. There are other kinds of cost behaviors out there. Some examples would be step cost or curvilinear cost and other things that describe the cost behavior in a specific business. But for our purposes, we're going to focus on fixed and variable cost, as they are not only common, but they exist in all businesses, and so all managers need to be aware of these cost behaviors so that they can use that to improve their business decisions.